Hi everyone, I hope you're all doing really well and welcome back to my podcast, Life of an Artrepreneur. The topic I'm going to talk about in this week's episode is actually something that I've been thinking about a lot recently, which is if you're known for a certain style of art, should you stick with it or is it okay to kind of switch it up? And I guess there has to be a balance, but at the same time it's difficult to know what to do, especially if you're building a whole brand around you as an artist and a certain style of art. For example, I'm probably known for my realistic style coloured pencil drawings, like portraits of animals. People join my Patreon to learn that specific style of drawing. And they're definitely skills that have massively developed over the years because I've spent, so long really trying to perfect or refine that style of art that I'm sort of known for now. I think naturally you do tend to gravitate towards a certain style of art, but it might take a lot of experimentation and trying out other styles of art or drawing first until you figure out what you like and what you enjoy. And to be honest, I think it's good to experiment even when you found your style, because otherwise you then risk sort of staying in the same place and not pushing yourself creatively. And I reckon that's one factor probably that can lead to burnout, feeling that you're doing the same thing day in and day out. It can become repetitive and you're not challenging yourself or switching things up, and it's like your brain kind of gets a bit bored and checks out a little bit. So having some variety and testing the boundaries of your creativity is always a good thing, especially as an artist. You don't ever want to be stuck in the same place, so try and keep those creative juices flowing if you can. I'm a pet portrait and wildlife artist specialising in realistic colour pencil drawings of animals, but I actually started out doing human portraits and predominantly working in oil paint, which is so bizarre because it's such a mess. And I feel like such a neat freak now. I don't like any of my artwork getting messy. I've got my coloured pencil organiser, which if you're watching on YouTube, you can probably see behind me. And paints are so messy. And oil paints are very long. You've got to wait for every single layer to dry. It's just such a long process. But at the time, I did really enjoy oil paint. So yeah, it's kind of crazy to look back and think, how my work has changed over the years in terms of the materials that I work with, the subjects that I like to draw. But it's also crazy to see how refined my work is now in comparison with 5-6 years ago when I just started really focusing on pet portrait commissions and wildlife art. You can tell that the quality of my work has massively improved. And that's literally because I've invested hours and hours of my time each day to drawing, learning from my mistakes, kind of leveling up my materials, learning, the best quality materials to use, and that kind of reflects in my work as well. I'm really trying to sort of perfect my craft, which has obviously led me to teaching others and teaching them that certain set of skills that I've really tried to refine over the years. Whereas if I'd spent the past 6 years doing little bits of this, little bits of that, constantly experimenting, drawing whatever I felt like and sort of switching up the subject that I draw constantly, then I wouldn't really be known for anything in particular. I think people would be confused if they looked at my Instagram and it was just bits and bobs of everything. I think doing something consistently and specialising in one specific thing, anyone that comes to your social media, they kind of get a feel for what you're all about. So it's that kind of building a brand part of being an artist and specialising in one particular thing that leads to that recognition. Whereas if you're experimenting all the time, it's difficult for people to remember you because there's not a specific thing that they can remember. I don't know if that makes sense. If you're doing so many different things at once, which a lot of artists do, and that's absolutely fine. I don't know, I feel like it's just easier for people to remember you if you've got something unique or consistent that they can relate to or remember. So it's definitely finding that balance between experimenting and building a reputation or a brand around a particular style or technique, or just something that you can be remembered for that kind of makes you stand out a little bit more against other artists. So find something unique to you that can be recognised. And like I say, whether that starts off as experimentation and you kind of gravitate towards one style and develop it, or whether you're an artist who enjoys doing loads of different things, then document that on social media, but try and show it in a way where it's memorable for people who go and look on your Instagram. They're not just overwhelmed with 100 different things. Some artists can literally work in oil paint, pastels, pencils, like they've got it all going on. And throughout using all those different mediums, you can still see that sort of same style coming through. So having something that kind of brings all that together, I think, again, is quite memorable. People start to recognise that style. No matter what material or medium you're working in, your work can still be recognised. So I've got quite a big platform on Patreon. I've got a really nice online community of like-minded artists who I speak to all the time. And there's been one patron in particular that I've just remembered in terms of this whole topic, where we spoke about how she loved doing digital artwork, like cartoon type illustrations, but then also loved the complete opposite of that, which was, learning about layers and detail within realism and the whole, everything to do with coloured pencils basically. And I think that's fine. She was kind of at a stage where she was doing a bit of both. She was getting frustrated with how long the realism took, and she enjoyed the quick, experimental character style of the digital artwork. But then she'd always love going back to the colour pencils. She found them therapeutic and relaxing, and she liked that balance. So I told her just to keep going with both, and over time she will probably naturally sort of gravitate more towards one than the other. But at the same time, it's still good to do both. You don't have to choose one. If you're a creative person, I think, it's difficult sometimes to really narrow it down into one specific niche. And to be honest, I don't always think you have to. I think if you've got two different styles of art that you really love, then do them both. I'd probably have two separate accounts on social media so people don't get confused. I've got my main art account on Instagram, which shows pet portraits and wildlife artwork, exhibitions and some behind the scenes stuff. I've got an account specifically for my podcast, and I've got an account on illustrations. And I feel like the illustration style work that I've done in the past, I've not really uploaded anything on there for quite a while, but that was focusing more on characters and being really imaginative. And I don't feel like if I started sharing that on my main account, it would kind of link or make sense. So I just decided to keep them very separate. But even so, I feel like the style is similar. It's still quite realistic, and I'm still using colour pencils. It's just nice to have them separate. But to be honest, art these days can literally be anything. So who's to say that you can't combine all these different styles that you like together and just have everything on one Instagram? It doesn't really matter, I suppose. But just thinking from an outsider's perspective, if someone wanted to commission a pet portrait and they looked at your profile and they saw a few pet portraits and the rest was this, that and the other, they might question whether that's what you do or whether you've just done the odd few. So I don't really know on that one. But for me, it's kind of worked having all of my different forms of art separate, like my podcast, my illustrations and my pet portrait and wildlife artwork. But they're all kind of under the same roof, if that makes sense. But yeah, I suppose my podcast, I'm kind of talking about art business and what I do. So it kind of links to what I'm doing anyway. And my illustrations and my main art account, again, are very, very similar. So yeah, it's up to you really, whether you want to combine everything together or have separate Instagrams and social media for different arty things that you're doing until you've decided or developed on that style that you like. I love Patreon. I've been on there for over 3 years now, I think, which is actually crazy. 3 years. And with Patreon, I never want to get to a point where it feels repetitive for anyone that's been on my Patreon for a long period of time. Obviously, anyone new who joins, it's all new for them because they get the whole backlog of content from the past 3.5 years. But for anyone that's been on there for ages, I'm very aware that switching it up here and there can be quite refreshing for people. And people who want to join my Patreon want to learn something or be challenged with that guidance. So I always ask for any requests or suggestions for upcoming tutorials and pretty much leave it up to them to decide. But recently I have tried to kind of switch it up a little bit because it can become a little bit repetitive, especially with realism and repeating the same techniques layer by layer. Sometimes it's nice to switch it up a little bit. So recently I uploaded a timed drawing challenge where I drew 3 sheep, the first one in 20 minutes, the second one in 15 minutes and the third one in 10 minutes. I might have mentioned this as well in a previous podcast episode, but everyone seemed to love that tutorial. I think if you're a perfectionist like me, when you go from spending so much time perfecting like the tiniest bits of detail and then to do a drawing challenge like that, it's actually really, really difficult because it forces you to loosen up and see things in a different way from a different perspective. But you can actually learn so much from doing that and pick up different techniques rather than repeating the same ones over and over. So yeah, I'm definitely going to be doing more time drawing tutorials, and I've got a few different ideas for the rest of this year that I'm definitely going to try just to switch it up a little bit. Just because I specialise in realistic drawings of animals in colour pencils doesn't necessarily mean that I have to consistently do that on Patreon. If I want to do a little tutorial on watercolour or a completely different subject, if you want to draw a flower, for example, it is always a nice challenge, and it's a challenge for me as well, because you get so wrapped up in realistic animals that doing something completely different really makes you think about what you're drawing in a completely different way. One of my tutorials that I'm going to be uploading to Patreon soon is all about drawing from life, which I've not done for ages. I used to draw from life all the time throughout college and uni. We learned so much about that, and I think because the past however many years I've been drawing from reference photos, it's completely different. So I think that'll be really interesting to do as a tutorial. And again, it's just something very, very different. I also recently uploaded the final part of the bumblebee tutorial on YouTube, where I used watercolour paints and a slightly looser style for the flowers, which is a complete contrast between like the tight details of the bumblebee, which was drawn in colour pencils. Once you know that you can draw something realistically and at a high standard every time, you're at the point where you want to start pushing yourself. And I didn't know whether the watercolour paints and the colour pencil work well together. It might have turned out awful, but I just kind of went for it, took the risk, and I'm glad that I did. And I really like the contrast between the loose flowers and the really tight details of the bumblebee. And if I hadn't have experimented or given that a go, then I would have never have known. I know that I could have drawn them flowers in colour pencils and got that realistic outcome. It's nice incorporating a different medium with the colour pencils and it resulting in something a little bit different. I'm definitely trying to push myself recently in terms of like backgrounds and drawing larger scale, and even trying to loosen up slightly like I did with the timed sheep drawing. It's actually so hard to go from drawing realistically to drawing loosely with like free flowing pencil strokes, because it almost feels unnatural and like uncomfortable to do. You kind of trust in the process, and you've not got control over everything that you're doing, and you know that it's not going to turn out like perfectly like it would do if we spent hours and hours and hours on one tiny thing. But I guess if you never try, you never know how it's going to turn out, and you might end up really liking it. For example, I keep using the timed sheep drawing challenges as an example, but out of the 3 sheep that I drew, it's actually on the wall behind me if you're watching on YouTube. I've managed to frame it now, so it's on the wall. But yeah, out of the 3 sheep that I drew, my favourite was the third one, which I drew in just 10 minutes. So it was the one I'd spent the least amount of time on, and because I'd almost like rushed through the shading and the texture details, it had like a looser, sketchy quality to the drawing, which I really liked. And I don't think you get that from like that realistic style of drawing. It's just something that you can't like recreate. It's just something that happens when you're just a bit looser. I think having multiple skills is a really good thing, and although being recognised for one specialist style is good in terms of building a brand, there's so many multidisciplinary artists who do like a wide range of work that can almost appeal to multiple audiences too, and they do just fine. So having that balance is important, but at the same time, like I said before, if you want to experiment and document everything, people love the journey as well. So they might like you trying loads of different things, seeing how you've, combined things together, or you like review on trying a new material. And then over time, you naturally develop into more of your kind of style that's a bit more specialised. And they might enjoy seeing that whole journey. But I think the most important thing though is for you to look back on your journey as an artist and be able to see that development and change within your work. As long as it's like ever evolving and your business is growing in some aspect, then I think that's a good way to have variety in your day-to-day work life and almost avoid that burnout. Creative people need to stay creative. They need to explore ideas, be imaginative, and like I said at the start, just keep those creative juices flowing as much as you can. So thank you so much for listening to this week's episode of Life of an Artrepreneur. Hopefully it'll give you some things to consider if you've been feeling like you want to experiment a bit or focus more on one style of art. If you've been watching on YouTube, then please like and subscribe. And if you've been listening on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, then I'd love it if you could leave a review. And thank you so much to those of you who listen every single week, and the ones that message me and comment on like every single episode. I really, really appreciate it, and it's really nice to know that I'm actually hopefully giving a bit of value. So yeah, thank you so much for listening and for the support of the podcast. So in the next few weeks, my plan is to get some other artists on the podcast, because by now you're probably sick of hearing my voice every week. I know that we've had this ongoing joke of how my voice is so soothing, whatever. But at this point, I think it's about time to get some other conversations going on. So look out for that. And if you've got anyone in particular that you want me to chat to, then do let me know by commenting below and I'll reach out and do my best to get them on. But yeah, thank you so much for listening, and I hope you all have a lovely rest of the week.